David, I think you should change the title to What Will We Learn?
Yeah. Well, let's hope an hour from now we maybe have some at least better questions to ask. And so obviously you can see the title of the lecture. I'm going to be reflecting on September 11th today on the last 20 years of American foreign policy, domestic politics as well. I want to be clear, I cannot be systematic in an hour. I'm not going to try to cover the whole waterfront. I'm going to try to strategically ask a few questions. And the emphasis is in part on questions. I will be somewhat opinionated in what I have to say. But if we are to learn from the last 20 years, if we are going to go forward with our politics, both international and domestic, in ways that indicate a process of digesting some of the failures and their implications, as well as perhaps of some of the limited successes, then we need to ask the right questions. I'm not an expert. I don't have all the information, but I will do my best to pose a few interesting questions. And so I want to start by asking, what do we see today, 20 years later, that maybe we didn't see as clearly at the time? And I'm going to assume we're all familiar with this. We are in the middle of doing a national reckoning today. You turn on the TV, you listen to the radio, you open the paper. It is inescapable that today is the 20th anniversary. So we all know that roughly 3,000 people lost their lives in a series of terrorist attacks, all of which employed airplanes as weaponized to attack buildings. Both the Twin Towers in southern Manhattan and the Pentagon were actually struck. A fourth plane was diverted from its ultimate target, which almost certainly was the White House, by its passengers who heroically fought to prevent it from reaching that destination, ultimately crashed the plane and perished in the process. That these attacks were sponsored by an organization called Al Qaeda, which many of us were only loosely familiar with at that time from attacks that had been sponsored by it on military outposts in Africa or further away from the United States. And that in the end, it appears that 19 almost exclusively Saudis were the actual agents of the attack, and that a fair bit of Saudi money went into the attacks, roughly $500,000, right? And when I say Saudi money, I don't mean government money, but money that originates in that country. So with just the barest outlines of a sense of what occurred, and I will say very briefly, I was in New York City on that day. And it was a vivid day for me. Even before that, it was my first day of my first full year of teaching at Sarah Lawrence College. It was my son's first day at school. I dropped him in Manhattan, went back to Westchester, and then couldn't get back to Manhattan to get him back. Another parent ultimately had to take my son home with him. And the day was horrific. It was a beautiful fall day that turned into an absolute nightmare for everyone here. And I in no way want to diminish that. As a matter of fact, I want to dwell on that for a moment. And moving now from the facts to the broader historical context for understanding our reaction. I think the first thing to note, and Jürgen Habermas, the great German social philosopher, referred to the attacks of September 11th as the first world historic events. And in saying that, he meant not that they were the first events that altered world history, but the first events where the people of the world simultaneously witnessed something that was going to dramatically affect their history, right? That with our new media, our new degree of interconnectivity, what happened in New York that day was witnessed not only everywhere in the United States, but practically everywhere in the world, more or less in real time. And it's not just then the power of a simultaneous experience to amplify the intensity of that experience, right? It's one thing to listen to a piece of music in your headphones or on your stereo. It's another thing to be in the presence of an auditorium with thousands of people simultaneously appreciating that music. It intensifies the experience. It is also the fact that this was continuously played and replayed as it unfolded in real time as we tried to determine what had happened and the magnitude of the events. And so in one sense, I do want to suggest that our reaction was conditioned by new media technology potentials that we were just really awakening to. I want to point to a couple of other factors that conditioned our reaction, and they're more basic psychological tendencies. One of these is the tendency to exaggerate the threat posed by novel risks. And to be as clear as possible, we're in the middle of one of these scenarios right now with the coronavirus. When a risk that you have never weighed, never even perhaps conceived before, suddenly comes looming into view and perhaps damages you, it is a basic tendency of human psychology for the novelty, the newness of the risk to perhaps exaggerate the degree of threat posed by the risk. I didn't think I lived in a world where planes could be weaponized. I didn't think I lived in a world where there would be a new pandemic spreading so quickly. This creates a sense of vulnerability and fear that is often exaggerated. And as we become more accustomed to now being in the world with this risk, we begin to be better at weighing, well, yes, there is a real risk, but there are also real costs to doing everything we can to make sure that that risk never actually damages us or damages us again. And so that's one, I think, thing that we see more clearly now with 20 years of hindsight than we saw at the time, that perhaps the threat, though new and novel, though spectacular and horrific, was not an existential threat, was in fact not likely to be repeated on that scale or with that magnitude of success at any point soon.
But David, we didn't know that at the time. We thought that all of our, any city that had a landmark felt very, very vulnerable at that moment.
Yeah, no, and so there is the moment, right, of the morning of September 11th when this is unfolding, right? And obviously we didn't invade Afghanistan or Iraq on the morning of September 11th, 2001. So yes, many of us felt what comes next, right? And there was an effort to scramble the Air Force to make sure that there wasn't yet another plane. There were some rumors that maybe there were other planes. But having said that, within a day, if you remember, US airspace was locked down, right? And new security measures were put in place. And so my question is not really how much fear should we have felt that morning or that day or that week, but it is instead, should we have declared a war on terror? Should we have launched campaigns against Afghanistan and Iraq in order to counter the threat of Al-Qaeda or jihadi terrorism? And so that's the question I'm focusing on. It's not the fear of the moment, but whether that fear continued to influence our judgment and decision making perhaps longer than it should have. Does that make sense, Wilma? Okay, good. If there and please, I'm happy that you immediately raised the issue. Please continue to interject whenever you have a question or thought. So the other psychological tendency, and this is a psychology 101 experiment. You put a device on somebody's shoulder that measures force, and you bring two young men to the front of the classroom, and you ask one to punch the other in the shoulder, and then you tell the person who's just been punched, now you can punch back. And what we find when we do this experiment is that the person who has been punched punches back much harder than they were punched, right? That the response is not proportionate to the original injury. And when we ask the people, they almost always say, "Oh no, I just punched back as hard as I got punched," right? And so again, there's a basic psychological tendency here. When you do not anticipate, right? It's different from being, in a boxing ring. Obviously, then you anticipate you're going to be hit. But when you do not anticipate being hit, you tend to feel vulnerable. You tend to feel assaulted, insulted, and to overreact. And again, I think this also conditioned our response, that in a sense it's a natural psychological tendency. Nevertheless, I will suggest later that one of the things that good leaders do is they attempt to moderate some of the natural psychological tendencies of the people in a democracy, and to say we need to react intelligently as opposed to emotionally to these events. A fourth aspect of the context that I think we understand better now is that we had taken for granted a sense of security that was generated by continental isolation. We were not going to be attacked by Mexico or Canada. We had a buffer between us and most of the rest of the places in the world that might do injury to us. That the only other attack of this magnitude over the past century had occurred at Pearl Harbor, which was not the continental United States. And all of a sudden, in our midst, right, not military, but ordinary civilian targets, or well, civilian, I should say, landmarks were being targeted, right? And this brought home in a very abrupt way that the new technological realities of our highly technological society were shattering our sense of security and creating new vulnerabilities. And so had this happened in another society, a society that was perhaps less secure, we might not have reacted in the same way. But in the United States, this certainly penetrated and ultimately shattered a sense that we don't have to worry about this kind of thing. Final factor is that it's worthwhile remembering. In 2001, we were basically a decade out from having, quote, won the Cold War, from having defeated our major international rival. And we actually witnessed that rival disassemble its empire and begin to set out on a path that made it appear that perhaps they would become more like us, a potential future ally instead of a rival. And there was a sense of, after 50 years of Cold War and decades before that of World War, that perhaps the world was becoming a safer and more cooperative place. And again, I think that the context there helps to understand both the sense that this is a new and unanticipated threat that requires all of our energy and great might and military force to counter, and also the sense that we continued in many ways in our foreign policy establishment to be guided by Cold Warriors, by people who had developed their strategic thinking in the context of having a single major, almost militarily equal rival. And we perhaps too quickly assimilated the terrorist threat to that mold. And so what I want to say, and then I'll be as clear as possible about this, I do think that in many respects, our response on September 11th and in the subsequent months, which eventually we organized under the rubric of a war on terror and conducted that war not as strategic counterterrorism strikes, but against countries, against especially Afghanistan and Iraq, but also in Syria and Libya and Yemen, that these campaigns were counterproductive, that did not accomplish their ends from our narrow strategic perspective. And certainly they also have been hugely destructive and destabilizing for the societies and regions in which they were launched. And so in that respect, I do want to suggest that these factors help us to explain what in retrospect we have to regard as a strategic failure. And I want to suggest at least two respects in which this was a strategic failure. The first is that we fell into the trap of elevating Al-Qaeda and perhaps other jihadi organizations, increasing their stature, their profile, their credibility, precisely by declaring war on them, by going to war with the Taliban and then Saddam Hussein in order to attack them. We inflated their significance, and actually this served to bolster their credibility and to increase dramatically their capacity to recruit. And so this is the first instance where our strategy, as opposed to degrading, actually in many respects strengthened our enemy. And I point out that this occurred, of course, in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, in a region where there were many people who felt that the 20th century had been very bad for and to them, that they lacked in agency, that they lacked in dignity, that since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they had been the plaything of other powers and never themselves powerful, that they did not fully participate in the goods of modernity while bearing many of the costs of a modern society. And so there was a kind of natural affinity for an organization that promised to empower them, and that we played into the hands of Al-Qaeda and other organizations in suggesting that perhaps they were a powerful organization that would finally serve to restore some dignity and agency in this part of the world. The second big strategic failure, which again, I think these factors help us to understand, is that we waged wars that could not possibly be justified or won. And I want to be as clear as possible. This applies to Iraq, but not as clearly to Afghanistan. I think under the canons of international law, just war theory, there is a story to be told, at least, about the justification for invading Afghanistan, given that the Taliban offered safe harbor to Al-Qaeda, refused to turn them over to us, the other aspects of that regime as well. It is clearly not the case that the war on Iraq was justified, and I believe it is clearly the case that we should have understood and appreciated that at the time. We clearly know this to be true now, that there was no relationship between Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime and Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations, that they did not possess weapons of mass destruction, and they certainly were not going to make those weapons of mass destruction available to terrorists. And again, I do think in a sense that the holdover of the strategic thinking of the Cold War suggested, well, if we're going to have a major international rival, obviously they're going to try to get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. And obviously that is a nightmare scenario. Terrorist organizations with access to nuclear weapons, to chemical or biological weapons, is a terrible threat to us, a genuine existential, or at least profound strategic threat to us in the way that Al-Qaeda in fact wasn't. But there was no plausible scenario in which Iraq was going to be the conduit for those kinds of weapons for those organizations. We should have appreciated the Shia-Sunni divide better. We should have understood the capacities of Iraq, or allowed inspectors to determine what those capacities were. In terms of the second factor here, wars that could not be won, and let's talk more about Afghanistan now. It's a basic prerequisite for being good at any kind of strategic enterprise, whether it's chess or war planning, that you be able to think 3, 4, or more moves ahead. And clearly we understood that we could take out, or at least degrade, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan militarily. We were exactly right that we had overwhelming military supremacy against the Taliban, and that the Taliban was a fragile regime that essentially dissolved when we invaded. And so that was correct calculus, but insufficient. What do we do after we degrade Al-Qaeda, after we topple the Taliban regime? And I want to suggest that in 2001, 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, 20 years later, we didn't have a good answer to that question. And that to launch a war without a clear exit strategy, without a clear path to a victory that isn't just the temporary removal of a regime, but a long-term solution to the security problem that that regime and its successor regimes will pose, is not adequate strategic thinking. And again, we clearly recognize this in historical retrospect, but I do think we need to focus on what led us to exaggerate the risks, to engage in such sloppy strategic thinking at the time, in order to at least begin to digest the implications of our failures for
David,
us going forward.
I
Yes,
have-
please.
I have another question.
Yes, go ahead, Wilma. You're muted, Wilma. Can you hold your space bar down?
Look, to think that, I mean, we were facing an ideological conflict, and to think that you can win a war of ideas with bullets is insane to me. And we're still in that trap. We're not in a mode of dealing intelligently and trying to understand what we're dealing with. So nothing's changed in 20 years. As soon as you say war on, it's a bad frame. It's insane.
Thank you, Wilma. And again, I find myself in complete agreement with what you're saying. And I'll just say, right, if we had fought this as a war of ideas, if we, and I'll say more about this in a moment, if we had treated this not as war, but as a crime, and sought to extend the capabilities of international law to deal with it, I think we would have been much more successful. So yes, I do think we misframed it at the outset. And what I'm about to start speaking about, a second set of issues, which is domestic politics, I think helped to explain why we misframed it, or why our leaders encouraged us to misframe it. Because I think it's worthwhile noting that public opinion was in shock, and certainly not well formed, and that it was really decisions coming out of the administration of George W. Bush that led to the frame of war being imposed on what was happening on September 11th and in its aftermath. So let's get into those domestic political considerations. And I'm going to try to move through these concerns quickly because I have one more big set of concerns I want to raise. But I want to raise the big question: is strategic immaturity, and I've tried to make the case to you that strategically the way in which we responded to September 11th was ultimately a disaster, and that we should have been able to see it as such beforehand. So if that's strategic immaturity, to say the least, is that intrinsic to democracy? Our democracy is just not very good at foreign policy. And I'm describing the United States as a democracy, a country that elects its leaders, right? And whose leaders seek re-election and are responsive to a public that's organized into political parties, that kind of democracy, right? Or instead, was there a particular constellation of cultural effects at turn of the century America that made it such that although we could have been smarter, we could have done better, we didn't? I'm going to suggest that there are countervailing considerations, but let's look at them for a moment. And so some of the considerations that reflect the particular constellation, I would suggest, have to do with the afterglow of the US victories in World War II and the Cold War, and the idea that we had been fighting and winning good wars, that this was something that we were good at, that we were on the side of right consistently, and that once we fought those wars, it actually had good consequences, right? The Germans, the Japanese reformed themselves with our assistance to become regimes akin to our own regime, that it appeared the Russians were on their way to doing the same. And this supported what's sometimes called the end of history narrative, which was made popular and famous, perhaps infamous, by Francis Fukuyama at Stanford. The idea that the United States had won the Cold War because the kind of government that it had was the best kind of government, the best way of organizing a society human history had ever produced, and that ultimately the world was going to converge on Western liberal capitalist democratic forms of government. And so if we accelerated that process by tearing down some authoritarian regimes, the people would be grateful to us. And again, I think, many of us were critical of these ideas in 2001, but we can understand at least that this is maybe not an intrinsic liability of democracy so much as a mindset that emerged out of our historical situation and experience. The final factor here is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we viewed ourselves as the unrivaled sole superpower. We were spending as much in our military as practically the whole world put together spent. We had technological supremacy of a kind that was unrivaled. Why shouldn't we use this tremendously powerful tool to accomplish our foreign policy results, right? Wilma has already suggested we should have known at the time that violence was not the right tool. But I want to suggest, at least in the foreign policy establishment, there was a reason for thinking that maybe violence would work, war would work, in part coming out of the particular moment we were at in American history. Now, turning to the question of, is this intrinsic to democracy? I want to say probably not, but that democracy, particularly in foreign policy, requires good, sound, strategic leadership, and that we need to have something like, sorry for the term, a brain trust. We need to have people in our military and our national security and our foreign policy apparatus who, in a sense, temper what we recognize to be often the excesses of democratic politics, the distractedness, the tendency to focus on the domestic, and that these leaders and this broader community of experts should assist us, the people, in not overreacting in a particular moment of crisis. That this did not happen in 2001, and it did not happen due to a tendency in democratic politics, a tendency that we've got to recognize so as to not fall into it again, which is to instrumentalize foreign policy for domestic advantage. And of course, George W. Bush had won a highly contested election due to the Electoral College and the intervention of the Supreme Court, not due to popular electoral victory. And he was searching for a set of policies that would allow him to firmly occupy the mantle of the President of the United States, and becoming a wartime president clearly allowed him to do that. And this then is another contingent factor, but a factor that has perhaps deep roots in the nature of modern electoral democracy. Third tendency I think we need to recognize, which is the tendency of democratic peoples to demonize non-democratic others, right? And Kant famously postulated that democracies don't go to war with each other, in part because peoples who are in charge of their governments don't demonize each other. But I think the converse of that is when we are attacked by a non-democratic society, particularly at the quote end of history, it makes it very easy for us to view ourselves as exclusively innocent and in the right, and those who attack us as inherently vicious and attacking us for our equality, for our freedom, for our diversity, for our inclusiveness. And it made it easy to demonize those who attacked us and to fall into the idea we don't need to convince them, we need to defeat them. A fourth factor, again, very quickly, and I'm drawing here on Daniel Rogers' wonderful book, The Age of Fracture. And one of the chapters in that book is about losing the words for the Cold War. He points to Ronald Reagan, that we had demanded 50 years of discipline and solidarity and strategic maturity of ourselves as a people as we waged world wars and then the Cold War. And maybe we had just lost that discipline, or to put it differently, we were fatigued and exhausted with it. And so we fell into, frankly, sloppy thinking about how to respond to September 11th in a way that we perhaps wouldn't have with the discipline of the Cold War. And then I want to say one last thing, and I think there are many people today bemoaning the way in which partisan polarization infects foreign relations. The fact that Joe Biden is not the one who lost this war, only the one who actually acknowledged that we lost this war, is being used by Republicans to try to undermine his presidency, right? That's the line. This wouldn't have happened 20 or 50 years ago. We would have halted partisan politics at the threshold of foreign relations. And I don't want to suggest that's a good thing, but I do want to suggest that there needs to be some space between bipartisanship and complete partisan instrumentalization and polarization around foreign policy. We need to have good, healthy debates about our foreign policy and not assume we should all fall in line, or that we're simply going to seek maximal domestic advantage. Unfortunately, in the buildup to the wars that we label the war on terror, we fell into kind of bipartisan lockstep for the most part. And so yet another factor accounting for some of the strategic blunders of 2001 and subsequent years. I want to spend a few minutes on what I consider now to be the broader domestic effects. And some of you may have seen the op-ed by Spencer Ackerman in the New York Times, either today or yesterday. And I have referred already to his book, The Reign of Terror, as being, I think, very important for tracing the domestic effects. And some of this is stuff I've spoken with you about before. I'll be brief. The narrative that took hold is one of American innocence, right? We were purely the victims of these attacks. And I want to be as clear as possible. Clearly, the people who were killed in the World Trade Center were innocent in terms of being civilians, not being directly responsible for American foreign policy, etc. But having said that, this idea that we did nothing wrong, that we're being attacked for our virtues, not for our potential vices, took hold and controlled our conversation for years. And the result was that we completely rejected the idea of listening to the other side, of asking, what are their grievances? Not necessarily in order to legitimate or endorse those grievances, but at least to understand them. Because again, Wilma's point that if you want to fight your enemy effectively, you have to understand them. And if you believe that a war of ideas at least has to be a component of this, if you start out just praising and flattering yourself and completely dismissing the idea, well, there's maybe a good critique to be made of American foreign policy in the Middle East, and that there are people who have legitimate grievances to being treated like pawns or playthings, or merely as places from which resources can be extracted, then you fail to understand why it is not only that the people who attacked us on September 11th attacked us, but why many people in this part of the world actually celebrated those attacks and supported the organizations that attacked us. Second aspect of this, and you will see I'm kind of building here, which is the revaluation of the immigrant as an existential threat to American democracy. And please note, right, I think Spencer Ackerman is right, that in retrospect, we can see the lines that connect September 11th, 2001, the war on terror, and then the birther movement, right? The idea that Barack Hussein Obama is a Kenyan and a Muslim, and therefore not a legitimate president of the United States. And then the deeper move to suggest that immigration is an existential threat to American democracy. We welcome to this country the people who ultimately attacked us. We can't repeat that mistake. This still reverberates in American politics. In fact, it was amplified. Remember that birtherism is popularized by Donald Trump, and ultimately Donald Trump enacts a, quote, Muslim ban, wants to build a wall on our southern border to keep immigrants out. Immigrants now understood as a threat to America and our way of life. That again, this goes back to the way in which our response to September 11th has distorted not only our foreign policy, but our domestic politics. I want to now move to the idea that one of the things we tried to do, as opposed to acknowledging our interconnectedness, our new technology, the new vulnerabilities that created, and then attempting to create policies that addressed those new realities. And by the way, the new potentials, the new possibilities they open as well. We instead tried to restore a fantasy, with apologies for and, that should just be a fantasy, of inflated unilateral power and agency. We have the biggest military. We can use it to swat down these insolent enemies of ours. And in fact, we now know we fell into a trap, and that we in fact strengthened our enemies. But even more deeply, the idea that we are the global bully. We can do whatever we want, feeds also into a way of thinking in domestic politics that reduces our interconnectedness, our responsibilities to each other, the limits on our ability to individually and unilaterally accomplish what we want, our mutual dependence and our need for cooperation, right? And so ideas that start in the international sphere reverberate through our domestic politics. And now bringing this all together, I think it's worthwhile to remember or to use history to reflect on the fact that things that we may not have been as aware of were in fact really moving quickly, perhaps under the surface of American politics in the early 2000s, the late 1990s. This includes deindustrialization and the transformation of our economy, a transformation that rendered a whole large swath of American workers much more vulnerable, much more precarious, much more resentful, that ultimately gave rise to the opioid crisis. That it was also coinciding with rapid demographic transformations. We were going from being a 90 to an 80 to a 70% white society to a much more diverse society. And when you throw the 9/11 attacks into this, the way in which they were associated with immigrants as other in the radical sense, the idea of restoring our power and agency, you begin, I think, to see the way in which the really nasty nativist politics of the last 5 or 6 years are perhaps rooted in the response to September 11th, 2001. And then let us not forget that the wars that we launched and the way in which they destabilized that region and the subsequent, I don't want to say consequent, but they're certainly not independent, uprisings in Egypt and Libya and Syria, destabilized the entire region and gave rise to wave after wave of refugees and immigrants that landed primarily on European shores. And the way in which this gave rise to a right-wing populist response in Europe, and the way in which, in the age of digital social media, what happens in European politics doesn't stay in European politics, especially when you have political entrepreneurs like Steve Bannon, very eager to cross-pollinate American right-wing populism and European right-wing populism. So I'm not saying we should have anticipated all of this in September of 2001, but that in September of 2021, we can recognize some of the ways in which some of the worst features of our politics of the last few years may be rooted in the mistakes we made 20 years ago. The last thing I will make, primarily as an aside, is that in the aftermath of those attacks and the fear that they spawned, we licensed our government and some of the key industries within it to surveil us in ways that were really unprecedented. New technological possibilities with our use of cell phones and other forms of digital media opened up. And we took advantage of those possibilities, collected metadata on all Americans, expanded dramatically the FISA program to allow for essentially completely unaccountable surveillance with just the approval of a secret court, and that this continues to this day, both in terms of the industries we license to surveil us, continuing to collect and use our data in many ways against us, and in terms of the government's capacity to snoop on its own citizens. All right, so I now want to conclude with one final set of reflections. And so I'm going to pull back from both the strategic and the domestic, to think more holistically about the overall costs and a kind of reckoning of what we got for those costs. And I want to suggest, in a sense, we should probably think in a pluralized way about wars on terror as opposed to a single war on terror, and to recognize that there are ongoing strategic counterterrorism efforts in all parts of the world right now, in the Middle East and Africa, that occur mainly under the radar of public awareness. And this is in part perhaps a measure of their success, which is that at this point, our military and our national security apparatus better appreciate that not calling attention to some of these attacks, using them to strategically degrade the capacity of terrorist organizations by taking out leaders or infrastructure and remaining quiet about it, is the best way to conduct this war. And that some of this, I'm not sure, it's a genuine question for me, that some of this may be succeeding in preventing organizations that would otherwise be doing violence to innocent people from doing that. And so there may be some successes, but I think we have to also put in the scale the absolutely catastrophic losses, and that these are measured first and foremost in casualties, in the sheer scale of the deaths. And looked at the Watson Institute at Brown University and their study on the costs of war, which I think is very good and very important, sophisticated methodology, doing things that our government isn't doing. And it appears that between 800 and 900,000 people have died in the campaigns that have been organized under the rubric, the War on Terror, and that includes between 350 and 400,000 civilians. And I just want you to pause for a moment to think about that staggering figure, right? I then will push on very quickly to another metric with which to weigh the cost, and that's monetary. And as you can see, it has cost roughly $8 trillion to wage these wars, to build this infrastructure. And again, that's according to the Watson Institute at Brown, but Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winning economists, others have done the calculations. It does appear that something like that is the accurate figure. Please note that's between 2 and 3 years of the total annual expenditures of the US federal government, right? It's a huge figure. And then I guess I would ask, what do we have to show for these huge expenditures? What do the people of the United States have to show? What do the people of Iraq or Afghanistan have to show? Are we safer today? Are they better off today? And again, I want to emphasize that I think one of the main effects of these wars has been to increase the ability of terrorist organizations to recruit. Our efforts to fight our enemies, in many respects, our current enemies, have produced our future enemies and produced more of them, and perhaps more dangerous enemies. And so although there may be some genuine victories, some attacks that have been foiled or that never got off the ground because of what we have done, it is also the case we have sowed the seeds for future insecurity at the same time. So the point now to come back to this idea, this would have been better conducted as a war of ideas as opposed to a military operation. I want to focus for a minute on the intrinsic limits of responding to violence with violence. And I'm going to start by going back to political philosophy, my own field, and G.W.F. Hegel, who in the Philosophy of Right argues against John Locke. John Locke said, in the state of nature, there's a law of nature, and you get to punish those who transgress the law of nature. And Hegel says in response to Locke, well, without actually promulgated law, without law that is there in the books, and without institutions like the police and the courts to enforce that law, it's impossible to distinguish what is punishment, what is mere aggression, what is vengeance, right? And so that the person who thinks they are punishing somebody else for violating the law ends up generating in the person they punish the appearance that they are just doing violence to them. And then that person wants vengeance. And so vengeance begets vengeance in a cycle that is never ending, or at least only ends with exhaustion, right? And so I think we need to recognize that absent the rule of law, our sense of our own rectitude, we are just punishing those who attacked us or who refuse to turn the culprits over, is not perceived by those we inflict violence on in that way at all. And so part of the reason that the Taliban is more popular today after 20 years and billions of dollars of US investment is precisely because many people in Afghanistan do not see the United States as trying to build a better government or trying to root out terrorism, but simply as another colonial power trying to conquer them. So we need to understand how others see us, and operating within the framework of the rule of law is one way to get people to differentiate mere violence from an effort to use the law to bring about peaceful cooperative relations, and then punish those who violate the law. Then you add to that the excesses in the way in which the war on terror was actually executed. And here you can think of the images that circulated globally of American troops humiliating in a ritualistic way prisoners in Abu Ghraib, in the Abu Ghraib prisons in Iraq, our use of torture, and the use of often forms of military violence that resulted in these large number of civilian deaths. And we have betrayed our own values, right? We look like a bullying, violent, vengeful, excessive superpower, not like a country committed to justice, progress, the rule of law, the way in which we perhaps like to think of ourselves. The fourth factor here, and now I want to criticize Obama more than George W. Bush and his administration.
Yes.
Go ahead. No? Okay, I couldn't tell if that was a question. I will wrap this up in the next couple minutes. So the use of drone attacks has, I believe, vastly increased the ratio of civilian casualties, right? And we'll see this. It appears yet again with what the military did in response to the terrorist attack from ISIS-K outside of the Kabul airport just last month, right? That we have again and again used remote, Biden likes to call it over the horizon, you might call it automated warfare, in ways that have intolerable, unjustifiable levels of civilian casualties. And again, this creates our future enemies. When your brother, your father, your uncle, your aunt, your sister, your child is killed in a drone strike and is no part of a terrorist organization, it is understandable that many people seek revenge, and that the jihadi organizations give them a vehicle for credibly seeking that revenge. And so the result is that American foreign policy in many ways has amplified and accelerated the growth and threat of radical terrorist organizations. Last thing I want to explore with you today is the question of the path not taken. And so I'm going to do a kind of alternative history, which is a technique that's used in history these days to think through what we did and what we might have done and how we can do better going forward. And so I'm going to start with the question of what are investment purchased here, and thinking in terms of domestic security, in terms of the lives and well-being of the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, in terms of the broader region where we've sowed the seeds of geopolitical chaos, or in terms of international institutions generally. Are any of those better off for the hundreds of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars that have been spent on the war on terror? And I want to suggest, while we need nuance, while we need to be discriminating and not condemn everything that was done under the banner of the war on terror, we do have to also reckon with the balance, right? And I think the balance sheet and the answer to these questions is clearly we've done more harm than good, that the money that we invested could have been better invested on other campaigns. And so let me just outline an alternative possibility for you. Let us say that on September 11th, 2001, we had said, we're going to spend trillions of dollars if we go to war. Let us spend trillions of dollars elsewhere instead, and had spent $1 trillion building up the infrastructure necessary for strategic multilateral counterterrorism campaigns, not wars, but strategic strikes, right? That might be the element of success. We should definitely continue to build on that element. But let's say, instead of then spending the other $7 trillion going to war, we'd spend a couple $1 trillion of it at home, taking the people who ultimately attacked the Capitol on January 6th, or the people who attend a Charlottesville rally. Remember that the FBI now thinks that domestic terrorism from white supremacists is a larger threat to domestic security than is international jihadi terrorism. If we had spent some of that money on domestic priorities, on creating new jobs or universal basic income or better healthcare or better housing, might we have a much different, much less fractious, much less nationalist tone to our politics? Might our own citizens be better off if we also spent a couple $1 trillion? These figures are staggering, right? Building up the capacity needed to use international institutions and international law to combat terrorism, to treat Osama bin Laden and the leadership of the Taliban as criminals, not as international rivals on whom we declare war, but on people who we need to capture, apprehend in order to bring to justice. I don't want to suggest that that was possible in 2001. It's probably not possible today. But had we spent some of the money we spent on war on building up the international war crimes tribunals, the International Criminal Court, the enforcement wings of those institutions, we might be much more capable today of being ruled by international law in the realm of terrorism. And again, I think that would be a much more effective and much more productive approach ultimately. Finally, we could have promoted democracy, development, liberalization intelligently in the Middle East and beyond, not by attempting to invade and then rebuild societies, but by providing the seeding, the sponsorship for domestic efforts to transform those societies from within, by giving grants, by using academics and people from the region who are interested in spreading democracy, liberalization, economic development, to award those grants, if we would have put a quarter of the money we spent to that kind of campaign, and if 800,000 people had not been lost to war, I think we could think that the region might actually be quite a different place, and in many respects, a place less adverse to our national security interests, not to mention much better for its citizens, especially its women, its children, its religious minorities today than it is in fact. Finally, if we had taken $1 trillion of those dollars and spent them on other national security priorities, whether that's climate change, cybersecurity, or other vital national security interests, again, I want to suggest we might be better off. So we can't rewrite history. We can't go back to 2001, cancel the war on terror, reinvest the money, the energy, the lives elsewhere. But what we can do is try to learn from our past mistakes. Maybe we need to start thinking about redirecting some of our resources in this decade that is just underway. Please note that the United States spends over $700 billion a year on its military. I will conclude on that thought. Happy to take questions and thoughts. Who wants to start us out? I can see John is eager to start. Go ahead, John.
We can all, or at least I can certainly agree with everything that you said, but in thinking the way the American political system works, it seems a little pie in the sky. An awful lot of the American government is devoted to keeping the military-industrial complex alive and well, and that runs completely counter to the kind of priorities that you have in mind. And given that, and then given the current domestic political situation in this country, where everything is a matter of extreme ideological combat, I think it is good to have that alternative scenario kind of idea. It's a good way to make us think that this isn't all inevitable, in the sense that there's nothing else that could be done. But I think we do have to also remember that it's not going to be done.
Yeah, and there's another idea from contemporary social science, which I know you're familiar with, John, which is the idea of path dependence, right? Once you're down a certain path 20 years, you can't go back and get on another path, in part because constituents develop for the path you are on, and they gain power over your politics, in part because having set down that path makes it impossible to get over to the other path that you now wish you were on. And so I don't want to suggest that we can undo this, or that reforming our priorities would be easy. I do want to suggest that, in a sense, the withdrawal from Iraq, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the rapid replacement of the regimes we fostered with alternative regimes should give us pause for thought. And that if we are ultimately able in a democracy to elect leaders who are responsive to our ideas, our concerns, our interests, we should be demanding something different and something more from our leaders. Now, having said that, of course, our politics is incredibly porous to money. And we didn't even talk about petroleum in all of this. And I think you can't really have the conversation about Afghanistan and Iraq without having a conversation about Saudi Arabia, for instance, right? And about the way in which the longstanding alliance with the Saudis affects and inflects foreign policy as well. So yes, there are big impediments to changing course. I don't think we're going to do it all at once. I don't think we're going to do it rapidly, but we need, I think, if we're not just going to continue making what we can now recognize as blunders again and again, we have to rethink how we got there and ask that different actors be able to influence American foreign policy and military policy. Bob, I can see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about throughout your lecture here is we need to understand the people and the societies much, much better. We seem, we got our society, we think everybody else should have it. No, we should focus on understanding what they're doing. Why does somebody become a terrorist? It doesn't seem like a particularly productive line of work. And if we could figure out better what people's issues are and how to address them, would be much more effective. So therefore, I'm suggesting much more diplomacy and not so much military and what.
Yeah, and one of the things I've been thinking about in thinking about these issues over the last few weeks is the fact that there is so little dialogue between academicians and anthropologists or emigres, people who might know the culture, the region, the complexity of the society that we're trying to influence better. It's too little dialogue between them and the people in the military and the foreign policy apparatus. And this, in a sense, is a product of the age of fracture, the people who spend the time to learn the language, the history, the literature, the culture, the religion of the society are often seen as lefty academics and not taken seriously by the people in the foreign policy establishment, right? We're too soft-headed, we're unrealistic, we're idealistic, we're pie in the sky, right? And that I'm not saying that we can convert them, but at least we need to have a conversation in which we take each other seriously and learn from each other. This is the, you'll hear this from me again and again, the real sad place we've got to in American politics, where increasingly we simply don't even hear those with whom we disagree. The disagreement seems to disqualify them as having anything meaningful to say. Yeah, thank you, Bob. Suzanne, go ahead. You're muted right now. You were unmuted a second ago. So can you, there you go.
Okay. I'm just wondering if you want to give some examples of where those lessons have been well learned and effective, because it's not just an issue for the United States. So where do we get counter examples?
So let me start with development aid, and there may not be enough examples to be particularly satisfying, but one example would be in restructuring development aid, and then this has been done with so-called microfinance and microlending. It's been done with some of the World Health Organizations and the World Banks and the development NGOs priorities, in which they've shifted away from large government-sponsored directed initiatives and tried instead to find people on the ground who could benefit from a small grant or loan, often taking women, because there's a very good recognition at this point that women tend to be more focused on their families, on the nutritional needs, on the educational needs, and that men often spend money that they get in developing contexts on status goods, as opposed to on investments that will eventually turn into sources of development and income for them and their society. And this ties in with this idea of funding democracy development, not by invading a country or by working exclusively with the government and the elites and trying to fund institution building, but really trying to work from the bottom up, trying to recognize that it took us centuries to build the culture on which our institutions rest. And that if we are going to try to promote change in other societies, we need to give them time and space and resources to do it indigenously, grassroots, from the ground up. And it's going to involve trial and error, and some of it is going to be wasted, but at least we can sponsor domestic efforts as opposed to trying to do it like a state with a big military from the top down. That just doesn't work very well, and I think we should see that. There are lots of examples of de-radicalization efforts, and so I think England has been very good at this as well. If we start to think about ways of presenting alternatives to jihadi ideology, or to the recruitment networks that bring these people in. And so that would be yet another example of a non-militarized response that I think might be more effective. I know that's not the totality. The final thing I will say is the use of war crime tribunals to go after the criminals in Yugoslavia, for instance, the former Yugoslavia, to go after the butchers of Rwanda, the use of truth and reconciliation commissions in South Africa, the effort to use things other than military force to hold people to account for their bad acts. If we could continue to build those institutions, to build on the very limited success that we've had, I think we could begin to envision a different kind and a less anarchical international society. And that would be good for the long-term interests of this country and the long-term interests of humanity. Flossie, go ahead.
Yes, a memory from 9/11. As soon as the cleanup began, the first thing I heard was that there were not too many Jewish people who died in the towers because they were all observing the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur holiday. And I was outraged at that, but I wasn't outraged when I heard the rumor that in Fremont, which has a large Muslim population, people were dancing in the streets. In other words, I think we have to begin to fight our own little prejudices and not think we are holier than thou. We have to recognize the poison in ourselves, not push it on others. And that's the hardest thing to do. And that's what we try to do in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Yeah, to reflect and atone, right?
Yes, reflect on
we have plenty to
the
reflect.
devil we think we are.
Yeah, and as opposed to that, you know, the mindset that took hold after September 11th is that we are blameless, we are innocent, we are completely in the right, and that everything that went wrong was the fault of others. And in a sense, that's just an incredibly immature, almost narcissistic way of looking at the world, right? And we do have to recognize the power that narrative, that framework, that worldview has in our politics now, and that is one of the consequences of September 11th as we reflect back on the last 20 years.
So, David, going back to your comment about the World Court and war crimes and whatnot, I think the United States military and or paramilitary should be brought up before that, because certainly they have perpetrated many atrocities.
Yeah, and we could talk about the unwillingness of Barack Obama to look at the potential criminal liability of our own national security agencies for using torture. We could look at the ratio of civilian casualty to genuine targets of military value in our use of drone warfare. There's a lot of territory there, Bob. Note that you just articulated the reason that we are not signatories to the World Criminal Court in Rome, because we don't want to be accountable, right? And so yes, subscribing to the framework of international law would in many respects require a deep reorientation of the way in which we conduct our foreign policy, both our worldview, but also then our more specific strategic engagements. All right, everyone, my computer is at 5% battery, and we are at, 10 minutes to 12 your time. I think it's time we end for today. As always, it's been a pleasure getting to spend Saturday morning with you. Take care, everyone, and to be continued next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
David.
Have a good week.
Thank you, David.
Of course, my pleasure. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.